like we've said, the Sibyls were Greek priestesses originally. And the Sibyl of Cumae in Italy originates from a time where that part of Italy was colonized by Greece. So a lot of the culture in that area, even prior to Rome's arrival, was actually Greek. So she was there before the Romans ever were. But they made her the most famous Sibyl of them all, thanks to Virgil. But before we get to Virgil, a little bit more about Pausanias. Pausanias goes on from his description of the Delphic Sibyl to describe the Cumaean Sibyl, and he claims that she was the next person after Herophile at Delphi to give prophecies, and he writes her name as Demo. Pausanias says he's getting his information from a Cumaean historian named Hypericus, who claims that Demo is a native of the area of Cumae. And that's all we know about Demo. We don't have, certainly in our time, there's nothing of hers that is extant. But even in Pausanias' time, none of her oracles had survived or had been written down. But apparently the Cumaeans had a relic. They had a jar, and they claimed that inside the jar were her bones. When Aeneas meets the Sibyl, he's at a critical point in his flight from Troy. So the Trojan War happens, he's a native of Troy, he gets a bunch of Trojans and flees, and then they travel from Troy all the way to Italy, where they now are in Book 6. Aeneas has already gone through a tremendous amount of hardship between fleeing from the war and all of the horrors associated with that, being lost at sea and subject to the loss of crew members and storms and getting washed up on territories that it turns out are not very friendly. And recently he's just lost his father, so he's at a really critical point and a really low point when he meets the Sibyl. Aeneas doesn't really know what to do at this point, but between the dreams and the visions and then the recent appearance of his father's ghost, Aeneas knows that he has some kind of destiny to fulfill, although what it is he couldn't exactly tell you. So now is the point, this is the midpoint of the Aeneid, so he's going to find out what his destiny is right at this critical moment, right before the intermission, we'll say. At this point, Aeneas really could use some spiritual guidance, and so he seeks out the Sibyl of Cumae. Virgil actually gives a name for her, Deiphobe. And by the way, if you're interested in the etymology of her name, I'm going to link an article down below from 2011 where this exact topic is discussed. It's only a few pages long. The Sibyl is with Aeneas for the duration of Book 6, his preparations to go to the underworld, the journey itself, the catabasis, the long prophecy that he receives from his father Anchises about what he's supposed to do and what destiny he's supposed to fulfill, which, by the way, is the whole purpose of him going down there in the first place, and she's there with him when he returns. The parts that I want to focus on are where Aeneas actually talks to the Sibyl and interacts with her directly and then watches her at work. Aeneas' first interaction with the Sibyl moves very quickly. Aeneas shows up to her temple and is looking at all of the mythology that's depicted on the doors of the temple, and she shows up and immediately starts chastising him. This is not the time to be looking at pictures. Shouldn't you be sacrificing? And so from there it moves very quickly. Aeneas makes the appropriate sacrifice, and immediately after that the Sibyl begins to change. I'm going to read to you again from Lombardo's translation. The Sibyl says, "It is time to demand your destiny. The god, behold the god." And as she spoke there before the gates, her color changed. Her hair spread out into fiery points. She panted for air, and her breast heaved with feral madness. She was larger than life now, and her voice was no longer human as the god's power took possession of her. "You hesitate to pray? Hesitate, Aeneas of Troy? The great mouths of this thunderstruck hall will not open until you pray." And then after that, Aeneas does as he's told and prays to the god Apollo, and then we continue. Aeneas finished, but the priestess had not yet taken Apollo's bit into her mouth, and she convulsed like a Maenad, monstrous in the cave, desperate to shake the great god from her breast. All the more, though, he tired her rabid mouth, tamed her wild heart, and molded her to his will. And now the cave's 100 mouths opened of their own accord and transmitted the oracle's response through the empty air. You have escaped the perils of the sea, but perils more grave await you on land. The Dardanians will enter Lavinium, be sure of that, but will wish they had never come. War! I see horrible war and the Tiber foaming with blood. You will have another Simois and Xanthus, another Doric camp. A second Achilles has been born in Latium to a goddess mother, and Juno will continue to afflict the Teucrians, while you, a suppliant, shall beg for help throughout Italy. And the cause for all this suffering for the Trojans shall be once more a foreign bride, an alien marriage. Do not yield, but oppose your troubles all the more boldly, as far as your fate and fortune allow. Salvation will come first from where you least expect it. A Greek city will open wide its gates. The Sibyl is essentially possessed by the god Apollo. She is truly just a vessel, a mouthpiece. She's described in wild and animalistic terms. There's a bit that Apollo is trying to put into her mouth as if she's a horse. She has a wild heart, a rabid mouth. She's convulsing like a Maenad. She's monstrous. She's no longer human. He says it explicitly. She is being possessed, and it is a physically traumatic experience, especially as you get later, and all literature gets more violent and gory. Lucan's description of this is pretty wild, and I recommend you reading it. But this is the price that the Sibyl pays for having access to knowledge the way that she does. Her prophecy, which is the first prophecy that Aeneas receives in Book 6, basically just outlines the rest of the plot of the Aeneid, and it all comes true in the context of the story. And after she delivers it, Aeneas asks her to accompany him to the underworld to meet with his father, and so that takes up the rest of the book. And he learns a lot about how the underworld works from her. There's a roughly contemporary account of Aeneas's meeting with the Sibyl that comes from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and I have David Rayburn's translation here. This is the one I've been using. I like it. I'll link it down below. And in the Metamorphoses, Ovid gives us a little bit more background on the Sibyl herself, the character of this Deiphobé, the specific Sibyl that Aeneas meets. He gives us an origin story for how she came to be the Sibyl, how she got her powers, and the price that she paid for it. It's worth reading the whole passage to you, so bear with me. Again, I'm reading from Rayburn's translation. So Ovid says, when he'd passed this place to the right and Parthenope's city of Naples, Aeneas arrived on the shores of the marshy region of Cumae and entered the cave of the long-lived Sibyl. His prayer was to traverse the underworld kingdom in order to visit the shade of his father. The prophetess held her gaze long fixed on the earth, till she raised her head as her soul was possessed by the god, and finally uttered in frenzy, "You ask great things, you greatest of heroes, whose valor was proved by your sword in the fray, and whose love as a son and a father was tested by fire. But, noble Trojan, you need not be troubled. Your prayer shall be granted, and I shall guide you to Pluto's realm, where you'll see the Elysian fields and meet your father's dear spirit. No path is closed to the virtuous man." So speaking, she showed him a golden bough which gleamed on a tree in Proserpina's forest, and told him to break it off from the trunk. Aeneas obeyed her, and so was allowed to descend and set eyes on the wealth of the awesome god of the dead, on his own forefathers, and lastly the ghost of aged Anchises, the great of heart, who taught him the laws which govern Avernus, and also the dangers facing his people in wars to come. Thence wearily climbing the uphill track to the earth, he lightened the tiring journey in talk with the Sibyl. And while he was plodding his fearful way through the murky twilight, he said to his guide from Cumae, "You may be truly a goddess, or merely beloved of the gods, but by me you shall always be counted a spirit divine, and I shall owe it to your consent that I came to the land of the dead, and returned thence after I'd seen it. For these great mercies, when I'm restored to the air above, I shall build you a sacred temple, and pay you the tribute of incense." The Sibyl turned to Aeneas, and heaving a deep sigh, said to him, "Goddess I have never been. An immortal creature may not be accorded the tribute of holy incense. Yet ignorance must not lead you astray. Eternal life was there for the taking, if only I had offered my maidenhood up to the love of Apollo. But while he hoped that I'd yield and desired to seduce me with gifts, he said to me, 'Maiden of Cumae, now choose what you wish to be yours, and your wish shall be granted.' I showed him a pile of dust that I'd gathered, and foolishly asked for my birthdays to equal the number of sand grains, failing also to ask that those years should always be youthful. Yet Phoebus agreed and offered perpetual youth as well, if I'd let him enjoy my body. I spurned his gift, and remained forever a virgin unwedded. But now the joy of my springtime is past, and weak old age with its trembling gait is upon me, age to be long endured. I have lived 700 years, but still have to see 300 harvests and seasons of vintage to equal the number of grains in the pile. The time will arrive when the length of days shall shrink my body from all it's been to a tiny frame, and my age-worn limbs be reduced to the weight of a feather. Then no one will ever believe that I was once adored and desired by a god. Yet even Phoebus may fail to recall me, or else he'll deny that he loved me. So changed, so invisible. Yet the fates will leave me my voice, the voice by which men will know me." So Ovid gives us more background on the Sibyl herself and her interaction with the god Apollo. Like I was talking about before, she has to pay a price for the gifts that she's given by the gods. Usually there's a trade-off. In her case, she was kind of tricked, even though Apollo was willing to grant her anything that she wanted, and he even offered a suggestion to make her request a little bit better for her. But it came with a price, and she wasn't willing to pay that price. So she has this eternal connection to the god, even though she rejected his advances. And she also has this extra long life. She's already lived 700 years, and she has to live 300 more as a result of this quasi-curse from the god Apollo. But that whole time she'll be able to practice prophecy. Even when her body withers away, she'll still be able to use her voice. And that was sort of what I was talking about before. The identity of the Sibyl herself matters less than the work that she's doing. She's a vessel for the gods, so it doesn't really matter so much her own personhood. And that's why even after her body will fade, her voice will remain. So we have two versions of Aeneas's interaction with the Sibyl. Like I said, Aeneas is at a critical point in his journey. He's seeking out the Sibyl right as he finally sets foot in mainland Italy, which is his final destination. He's not in the right part of Italy yet, but he's reached, the landmass that he's looking for after wandering for so long at sea. His conversations with her and the journey that they take together is kind of like the last step in Aeneas's initiation, right before he actually starts to carry out his destiny, now that he knows what he's supposed to do. Everything up until this point has been getting him to that place, and the Sibyl is this last advisory figure that helps him out. So we'll leave Aeneas there for now.